Welcome everybody to the JPEG channel. Today we'll talk about REITs, that's real estate investment trusts here in Singapore. How do I come up with that topic? Originally, when I moved to Singapore, I at some point was thinking of buying an apartment. It's not very easy. There are a lot of costs involved, there is a lot of tax involved, and at the end of the day, I had to say this, it's not worth it. I did all the math and the end result was it's not enough return when I buy an apartment in Singapore. It was around 3-4%. Then I got into the topics of REITs. So that's a direct investment into bigger properties that can be office space, it can be shopping malls, etc. And with REITs, I noticed returns are much higher. They can be 5, 6, up to 9 or even 10%. And that's where I realized it's much easier to invest my money in REITs than when I buy a huge property with a big loan, which is really a heavy investment. So that's why I got into the REIT investments in Singapore, and I will show you now the big benefits of it. I don't want to sell you on it, but I want to explain it, and it could be an option for you for part of your investments. Singapore is a very highly developed country, and when you fly to Asia and you have the chance to do a stopover in Singapore, I really can recommend you that. It's a super modern city. It's very clean, it's very stable. The government is strict, but it makes it very safe, and there is absolutely no criminal activities around here. Two things are very typical Singaporean. Number one is food. They all are foodies here. They love different kind of foods. They like to try out new food. There's so many restaurants in the city. Second one is properties. Singaporeans love properties. They love to discuss about properties as soon as they have some money and have some savings. The first thing they think about is investing in a property or buying their own property in Singapore. Singapore is a city-state. It's a very small city. So I wanted to put it in perspective of the size of Switzerland, and I have here the Swiss map. So that's Switzerland, a small country as well, but when we put Singapore over it, we see that Singapore is even much smaller than Switzerland. It's approximately the size of the Zurich Lake and probably the canton of Zurich, which is equivalent to the size of Singapore. When we look at the GDP growth, we see that Singapore is a very strong country, and I compare the GDP numbers with Switzerland, and over the last 40 years, they increase by approximately the same percentage amount. So they're very strong economies. They are very small, but they're strong and stable. Singapore has several benefits here. That's why it's a very interesting country to do investments. So there's no tax on capital gains, there's no tax on dividends. Me living in Singapore, the only tax I pay is the income tax, which is relatively low compared to, for example, in Europe countries or in the US, etc. Unemployment rate as well is very low. It's in Singapore last year, 2019, was around 2%. In Switzerland, it's slightly higher, it's 2.5%. So when I think about investing in properties, I like to have more of a global perspective on it. And I want to compare other markets, how are they performing against Singapore or any other country. And I have the UBS Global Property Bubble Index, which comes out every year, which gives that perspective, a global view on the property industry. Countries with high bubble risk, so in red, and then we have the yellow ones, which are more of an overvalued state, not high risk yet, but overvalued, and we have the ones which are fair valued. And what we can see here is that Hong Kong is the number one of highly risk bubble city. We have second Munich, then Toronto, Vancouver, Amsterdam, and London. So they have a high risk that they're in the midst of a bubble in the housing industry. On the medium sector, we have Stockholm, Paris, etc., as well as Zurich, which is as stated as overvalued. And at the more safe side or fair valued in property perspective, we have Singapore. So what's the conclusion? We have high bubble risk cities such as Hong Kong, Munich, Toronto, and we see over the last 5 years that house prices in major cities in general increased by around 35%. So that's already a very high increase. Reasons are different reasons. We have easy finance conditions, the interest rates were very low, taking up a mortgage is very easy, and also the growing importance of urbanization and people moving from towns and outskirts into cities is more and more a topic which leads to increased house prices. Singapore versus Hong Kong and the development of the prices since 1982. And very clear, Hong Kong has an extreme price increase in the property market, which leads to this very high risk of a bubble, whereas Singapore was rather a boring market, relatively stable and steady over the last couple of years. Obviously, this graph is not up to date. This is showing till 2018. Hong Kong experienced last year social issues, and we had now the current 2020 crisis, which leads to even more an impact on property prices, which are declining currently. Another interesting graph is from UOB, so that's a local Singapore bank. So starting from 2011, prices from big cities such as Hong Kong, New Zealand as well, China, Shanghai, Beijing, and Malaysia, they increased very, very strong the last couple of years. We have other cities and countries such as Australia, which were actually declining the last few years. We have slow increases in Thailand, South Korea, and Taiwan. And the UK even declining slightly over the years, and Singapore, which was declining from 2013 until end of 2017, and then started to have price increases since beginning of 2018 again. So this gives us an interesting global view on the property prices, and it shows that every city, every country has their own development in property prices. So what is a real estate investment trust? So let's get to the actual topic. They're also called S-REITs for Singapore REITs, and they are listed like a company. They have they're pooling investors and pooling the capital, which enables them to buy big properties or have big investments in buildings such as office space, shopping malls, hospitals, etc. So in Singapore, there are around 40 REITs on the market. Not all REITs invest solely in Singapore. They can also invest anywhere else in the world. So these properties are leased out to tenants, and the return from it, so the rent, are the dividends that are being paid out. So therefore, investors of REITs are co-owners of these properties. So these rental incomes from the property assets are being distributed regularly. Usually every quarter or every 6 months, there is a dividend payback to the investors, and that is between 5 to 8% on average. Main objective of the REITs is therefore passive income. It's not really the capital gains. There is also an aspect on it, which was very big in the last few years, but it's mainly to get the dividend returns. So Singapore REITs are required to pay at least 90% of their taxable income each year towards the investors. So that's a very high amount. So all the rental income that comes into the REIT gets distributed back to the investors. As property asset gain, or they can also lose value, investors participate in form of increased capital gain from these REITs. So it's not just the dividends, it's also the capital gain of a house. So you can compare it when you buy a house in your city, the house gains value over the next couple of years. If you rent out the house, you get rental income over the years. And so we have two possible income streams. So one is directly the rental income or the dividends that come in, and the other one is the capital gain. So once you sell the REIT, you can sell it at a higher price. So it's a very liquid market, and you can sell it and buy it as if it's a stock. So there's some very popular REITs on the market. If you were in Singapore, or if you know Singapore, we have, for example, Suntec REIT. They own 33% of Marina Bay Financial Center. They also are known for the commercial real estate portfolio and have 7 landmark buildings at a valuation of around $10 billion US. Another one is CapitaLand Mall Trust, which is one of the bigger REITs on the Singapore market. They have 15 properties focusing on shopping malls all over Singapore, and they have an annual shopping traffic of 338 million people visiting these malls every year. Ascot Residence Trust is more focusing on hotels and on service departments. They have more of a global portfolio. So they have 74 properties in 37 cities across 14 countries. So it's a more diversified portfolio that Ascot has compared, for example, to Suntec, which has a very heavy investment in Singapore. So you have different options on the REITs, and you need to figure out on your own what direction you want to invest in and what fits best to your portfolio. So there are some pros and cons comparing buying an actual property versus buying a REIT. And I put these pros and cons into this overview, and we'll go through it step by step. Looking at buying a property. So the big plus is that you own the property by yourself, and you have the option, you can rent it out or you can live in it. You do usually leverage the asset. So when you buy a property for 1 million, usually you can have a mortgage on it. You can loan from the bank, let's say 800,000, and 200,000 you need to pay cash for the property. So you have kind of a leverage. So let's say your property increases in value from 1 million to 1.2 million. With just putting 200,000 into the property, you gained another 200,000. So you have a 100% gain. So that's the benefit you have when you buy a property, and can only be done with properties. You can't take up a mortgage for buying REITs. That doesn't work. So let's talk about the downsides. There is a very high initial capital outlay that you need to invest in. So we're not talking about a few $100s or $1,000. It's really $100,000 to $300,000 you need to invest, and then you have down payments over the years when you take up a bigger mortgage. Also, market cooling measures have an impact on buyers. A very big tax is the additional buyer stamp duty, the ABSD. And I quickly want to show you this. So let's have a look at the ABSD. So when we see here the ABSD rates, Singaporeans, they do not have any ABSD tax. Then we have if they buy a second or third property, they do have to pay tax. but for your first property, there is no tax at all for Singaporeans. Actually, some countries have an exempt as well. So I'm Swiss. I do not pay ABSD tax. So I'm considered or being seen as a Singaporean when I buy an apartment. Then we have the foreigner buying an apartment, which is 20%. So it's quite a high amount. Imagine you buy a 1 million property in Singapore, you have to have 200,000 additional to pay for the tax. They even give us a very nice example. So if you buy an apartment for 2 million, you have 20% as a foreigner that you need to pay tax on. So that would be $400,000 just for the tax. So these are reasons why in Singapore prices are not exploding like in Hong Kong. So the government controls the market, and the incentive to buy as a foreigner is very low because of these taxations. So when the government sees that prices are increasing faster than what they expect, they are free to increase, for example, the ABSD tax. And that leads to less foreigners coming to Singapore and buying an apartment. The downside also is you have to physically manage the property or the mortgage. So you need to invest your time, you need to invest your money. There could be issues in your apartment that you need to fix. So there is a high administrative effort that you need to put into it. Also, rental income is subject to income tax. And that was actually at the end the reason why for me it didn't make any sense to invest in a property in Singapore, rent it out, and then get regular income from it. And then it's just generally finding a tenant, you have aircon issues, plumbing problems, chasing for the rent, etc. You need to be lucky that you have someone who is in your apartment who takes care of your apartment, someone who pays the rent regularly. So there are a lot of aspects where also a lot of luck is involved when owning a property. So let's go over to the pros and cons of buying a REIT. So there are a lot of pros. One of the pros is there is a relatively small capital outlay. It's not that you have to put in 100, 200K. You can buy a REIT for $100, $200, and it's relatively low. Also, they're listed on the stock exchange market. The stock exchange market is relatively liquid, so you know every day what's the value of your REIT, and you can sell it every day. It's not like you hold a property and you want to sell it, and then you need to wait months until you get a buyer who is interested in your property. Usually, REITs have a bigger portfolio of properties, which gives it a certain diversification as well, and also gives the opportunity to invest in properties which you usually would not be able to invest in. Then there is publicly available information about the REIT. There is a very high liquidity. There is a professional property management team behind it that manages the properties. And there is no tax on dividends, and there's no tax on capital gains. There is some downside. So REITs can be relatively volatile depending how the market goes. There is a lower leverage power. A REIT can maximum leverage 45%, and right now they changed it to 50%. And when we compare with other countries such as Hong Kong, they also have 45%, Malaysia has 50%, Thailand can leverage up to 60%, and the US has no leverage limit. So the REITs are limited on how much mortgage they can and how much loan they can take up for their portfolio. Another part is a management fee that needs to be paid, so that's equivalent to when I own a property. It's my administrative fees I have and my time. The same is with the REITs. There is a management fee to pay, and it's a relatively slow growth. As REITs need to pay out 90% of their income, they can only keep, so to say, 10%, which makes it a very slow growing investment. They're not able to every year buy new properties, do new investments. Usually they're focusing on the properties they're holding at the moment, and they do improvements on the current portfolio, but they're not really going out and buying a lot of properties over the years. So in the very essence, how a REIT works, and very simplified, we have on the one hand side the investors, so that's you or me. We invest in a REIT, so they hold hospitals, offices, and other real estate. And these properties have a dividend in return, which is, so to say, the growth. So there's rental income and there is capital gain over time. So that would be the profit. And the profits then go back to the investors, which is usually 90% at least, which is being distributed back to the investors in form of dividends. Go through it a bit in more detail. Who is involved in a REIT and what are the stakeholders? We have the investor, the unit holder, so that's you or me, who hold the REITs. So for this example, we're looking at Capitaland Mall Trust. So they are listed on the SGX exchange. That's where I can buy the Capitaland Mall. We have on the right hand side, we have a trustee. So the trustee is the structure for tax reasons, and it's the legal owner of the property. So they represent the unit holder, the investors, and they do have a trustee fee. On the other hand, we have the manager, the REIT manager, and he decides on which properties to invest in or to divest. So if they want to sell certain properties from their portfolio, and they also have and design the methods of financing the portfolio. So that's the management services they offer and the management fee that needs to be paid to the management of the REIT. So here we actually have the CMT, so the Capitaland Mall Trust portfolio, which consists of all the malls. So they have Bedok Mall in Bugis, they have Clarke, which belongs to Capitaland, and so on. So all these malls are under the REIT. So we need the property managers on the other hand, that who actually manage properties. So they usually have their own office in each of the properties. So they handle security, for example, they handle the cleaning, they handle new tenants showing the property, office space or the rental space they're offering, and they manage all of this, really the groundwork of the properties. That's it for now. I hope it was informative for you guys. It gives a good introduction on the REIT market, what the pros are, the cons are, what it actually is. I'm invested in REITs very heavily. I earn around $3,000 a month, so that's $36,000 a year just on passive income, getting the dividends from REITs on a quarterly or half-year base. Thank you very much for listening in, and see you next time. Thank you.